Hi everybody, welcome, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for Nesta Talks 2 today. These events are put on by Nesta and designed to be a conversation with today's most interesting thinkers, focused on the big topics that define our future. Before I properly introduce our guest, Kim, further, I should introduce myself. I'm Chande, I'm Director of Nesta's Affair Start Team. Our mission is for 2030 is to close the disadvantage gap in early years outcomes. We do that through innovation partnerships, where we work with local authorities, nursery providers, early educators and so on, helping them innovate with our team of designers, behavioural scientists, data scientists and more. If you're interested in working with us, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch. You can find our contact details on the website. Okay, back to today. We're really pleased to be welcoming co-founder of Equal Education, Kim Rihal. Welcome, Kim. Equal Education, co-founded by Kim, works to narrow the attainment gap for vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils who have some of the lowest attainment rates in the country. The gap is wider for children in care than other cohorts who consistently experience less positive outcomes than their peers. Equal Education believe this is an injustice and something they're committed to tackling. Even before the pandemic, students from disadvantaged backgrounds, as typically measured by those on free school meals, were on average 18 months behind their peers. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, great to have you here. Before we start the conversation, just want to go over some housekeeping about how this is all going to work. We're keen to make this as much of a conversation as the medium allows. So please post questions, reflections, observations in the chat, and we'll do our best to draw them into the discussion. If you'd like to view closed captions, and these are available particularly on the LinkedIn stream. Okay, Kim, to start off our conversation today, I'd like to ask, why did you set up Equal Education, and what is your organisation doing to narrow the education attainment gap?
Sure. Raj, I've had first-hand experience of witnessing children and young people unable to self-regulate their emotions. For example, throwing a chair across the room, resulting in violent outbursts in school. I was quite affected by how this manifests itself in labels and adverse outcomes, such as exclusions during formative years of a young person's life, and when they are developing a sense of identity that will shape their futures. Almost if you imagine when the brain goes through these fight and flight experiences, it becomes difficult or near on impossible to access learning. And with this in mind, on a larger scale, seeing the disjointed and fragmented nature of specialist education provisions, we came up with the idea behind Equal Education. So I worked with my co-founder, Paul, who was a science teacher and private tutor at the time, to persuade him the need to set up a vehicle to tackle this deeply entrenched societal challenge around educational inequality and meeting children's educational and social needs. I guess to summarise, we wanted to turn this Oxford and Cambridge model of one-to-one tutoring upside down, providing targeted and tailored tuition for really vulnerable children. And we felt this model could be a positive disruptor. And we know that private tuition only too often can exacerbate educational inequality. And we felt that this was a mechanism for those with fewer resources to access a trusted intervention. And as a result, we've been able to attract staff and tutors who are passionate about serving the children we work with.
Okay, great. So why do you use this model, and what are the benefits of this for your cohort?
Because we care about improving these outcomes. We believe that children and young people are most deserving of receiving this high quality support. For us, it's a tried, tested, proven model. And even research from the Education Endowment Foundation shows that actually it makes an average of 5 months additional progress. I just want to share a case study. We had a year 10 student who was diagnosed with Friedreich's ataxia. It's a rare inherited disease that causes progressive nervous system damage and mobility problems. And this young person was wheelchair bound, bullied in school. One of our tutors actually worked with him 3 hours a day for a period of 3 years. It's quite a long time. And this student was able to go from a level 3 to a level 7, sit an ICT GCSE, was aided by technology, so great use of an app that actually converted the text to speech, so he could listen to the content just because he suffered with so much fatigue. And I think that's just such an example of how one-to-one allows the trust to be built with this learner and for them to overcome such barriers to learning.
Thanks. I've got a couple of follow-up questions on that case study. I'm just wondering who were the tutors there, and what was their background?
Sure. So qualified teachers, we use qualified teachers to do this because teachers know their curriculum, they know how to teach, but alongside that, they are a community of teachers that are resilient and really care. In fact, Raj, we have such a community of tutors that for some of these teachers, they actually refuse and sometimes are not on board with private tuition, but by the very nature of the children we serve, actually do want to help and support these children.
Thanks. And you also mentioned there's a little bit of a process there, developing the trust between the tutor and the child. Can you talk us through how your tutors might typically go about that, or how they did it in this case study?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think first and foremost, what's quite important to note that actually you've got, yet another adult coming into this child's life. So it is going to take quite a few sessions to build that trust and to build that rapport. And I think often we see this could take range from anything from three sessions, to possibly 6 or 7, until that student actually feels comfortable to kind of say, actually, I don't actually understand this. Can you support me further? So it's really about understanding that, and through the communication with our internal team to support them. So, do we contact Ataxia UK to see actually what support could further be put in place for this student?
Thanks. I used to be a teacher myself, and so I recognise what you're saying. And I think it's a strange thing to seem like a proud moment, but having taught some students for a year and a half, when someone that could say, I don't understand what this is, that's actually a really lovely thing. Just one more thing on the case study. I mean, I know nobody can really answer this question for sure, but do you have a sense of what might have happened for that student, what kind of struggles they might have had if it wasn't for your organisation and the support they got through you?
Yeah, I think the fact that this young person wasn't able to access mainstream education, that their needs were such that actually a specialist school and awaiting a specialist named school provision on their education healthcare plan just would have taken so long. The fact that we were tutoring this student for 3 years. So my concern would have been the loss of learning, and the fact that they were able to go from a level 3 to a level 7 is absolute testament to how much they were able to achieve through this one-to-one tailored education provision for this student. Also taking into account their medical needs and their constant fatigue, and actually being able to use technology to further aid their learning. Yeah. So I would have been quite concerned they wouldn't have achieved as well as they have done. I mean, they're now going on to do a BTEC level 3 in ICT, which is it's just very exciting for us.
I can see that your face comes alive there particularly. I can imagine that's the best bit of your job. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned the evidence around it, the EF have written about tutoring. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we know this approach is effective, and share any other examples you've got of impact?
I think it's always delightful for us to hear when the student or parents and carers, even teachers, request the same tutor to come back the next term and tutor that student. So for us, it's really about collecting feedback throughout the tuition programme, particularly from parents and carers, and they provide wonderful accounts of the impact being made. I think conversations with designated safeguarding leads, remarking on how the student is willing to raise their hand in class and just participating, just being present, and kind of given the divergent needs, age ranges and nature of our provision. I think success is varied, and capturing this in a standardised way can be quite a challenge. We're not just looking sometimes at just the GCSE results, for example. So we're really passionate about measuring our social impact and kind of adding to the evidence-based, and having conducted an external impact report. I think this really shows that there's been high levels of impact on the confidence and the attainment. So measuring the impact of our tuition in 2021, for example, using a combination of student surveys, I guess the academic attainment as well, but we're able to kind of closely work with schools and local authorities to help prepare students for exams and look at their exam results. But we really value when schools volunteer this information. And obviously, I really appreciate the kind of pressures that they're under, and capturing the student voice is particularly important, I think, as we all know in this industry, how crucial it is to hear from the learner themselves. I think I think one example that would be really useful to know is this spring we implemented a framework that asks students what they want to achieve from tuition and measures their self-confidence, enjoyment and resilience. I mean, last summer our tuition programme with the Royal Springboard expanded by 600%, reaching 30 plus students with an average student approval rate of I think it was 92% for how beneficial they felt tuition was. And again, just reporting confidence and enjoying their subjects.
Yeah, I think that's an enormous achievement. I've got some more questions there. I mean, what's your sense of what's necessary to make this work? And I can imagine sometimes for everyone's best efforts, this approach doesn't quite get off the ground. And other times it sounds like it's really successful. Have you got an idea of what are the sort of like magic ingredients that really make it work? Is it the way tutors come into it? Is it the support from schools or other services? Give us a bit of a background on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think historically, Raj, there probably has been an assumption that it's quite an expensive intervention. And so actually it's really kind of helping to understand that and how impactful it really is to have that one-to-one, and how this works really well for students. And actually there's something about the relationship and the careful kind of matching of that tutor to that student, and I think that's really important. And sometimes that the relationship may not get off the ground, and I think that's something to be mindful of. But actually, how do we then stop that student from feeling like, actually, just because that relationship didn't work, this whole intervention isn't going to work at all? So I think there's something really careful about matching the tutor to that student and their particular interests, and whether they use some context-based learning. And I think an example of that comes to mind. We had a student who absolutely detested maths, but we had such a wonderful creative history teacher that actually used dates. And the student was, loved history, and so used dates to actually then evolve that learning process, use that kind of context-based learning, and that seemed to have worked really well. But collectively, yes, it is about getting schools on board, and really kind of supporting them in that process. And I think also you don't want to add to the administrative burden that's already, as you'll know, as a former teacher, Raj, that also is the pressure that teachers are under.
Thanks. Okay. I mean, I think you just sort of alluded to it earlier, but we were talking about the pandemic and tutoring, especially being used, or some schools trying to use it as a response to it. I mean, what are the key challenges? It's so much news coverage about this, but from your perspective, what do you think the key challenges are posed by the pandemic, and how do you think we can address them?
Absolutely. I mean, the school closures, we know what a protective factor school is, particularly for vulnerable children, almost providing this kind of welfare check. Has someone seen the child? Are they okay today? Have they even had a hot meal, for example? So one, I think there's something around the kind of care aspect, also the kind of loss of learning. And I think what's been quite concerning is how the amount of children that haven't even returned back to the classroom. So the severe anxiety, and the exacerbated mental health, the loss of learning, as I mentioned, the kind of gaps in learning. I think there's been media kind of coverage, which has been widespread around this. And I think what's really important to know is how shocking it was to realise how many homes didn't have access to technology and Wi-Fi and data, and even just a suitable learning environment, whether that was in the home or whether that was in the educational setting.
So so given the technological, I mean, like, we're all very lucky, all of us. I can tell we're all sort of sat here on webcams and some other gizmos to make us look better on them and so on. What are the main ways that how does that technological barrier manifest itself in what you're trying to do? How does that cause additional problems for you? And how do you try and work your way around it?
Pre-pandemic, we had quite a traditional view that actually it'd be great for that tutor to sit down next to that child and tutor them and teach them. And there was quite a magic in that relationship being built. Lo and behold, bestowed by a global pandemic, no one's going out, school closures. And I think that's what really, when we realised, gosh, how many children just we can't move this tuition online because actually children don't even have access to devices, access to the internet, for example. We were really passionate about this and felt that actually, here we are in this 2020, 2021, etc., that actually the children don't have access to this. So we applied for a grant with Innovate UK. We were successful, and this allowed us to roll out some iPads. And the reason why we chose iPads is actually we wanted to get a device that was so secure enough that what we didn't want to do is open up Pandora's box, so that children could access untoward websites, for example, even certain games that have chat room features. And that's fine. You want children to play games, you learn through playing games, but actually how do we then also safeguard children? And this was wonderful because we were able to then still continue to tutor children by providing these iPads, and they could still access their learning. And actually, this was actually featured in a report with Vodafone, Closing the Digital Divide. I think that this link will be shared by all means. But also then, what apps are we using? I think there's something to be taken into account that actually there's so much out there. How do you know what's right for that student? So we actually teamed up with some brilliant minds at UCL, and spoke to the students there who did a research piece around actually these apps are probably best for learning. And I think what's really supported that is the National Tutoring Programme, committing to put money into catch-up tuition and being committed to helping schools and local authorities to really maximise the subsidy available for tuition. So I think really it's about having that trusted adult and mentor kind of supporting you through that education journey.
Thanks. Just want to say a quick note to all the audience. Please do add any questions you've got in the chat, and I'll try and weave them into the conversation, but certainly in about 7 or 8 minutes we'll turn to audience questions. So get them lined up so maybe Kim can start thinking about them. Just going back to thinking about the technological divide, I mean, I've sort of noticed some schools, some education organisations thinking, oh, brilliant, actually now we've been encouraged to embrace these different technologies, it's better. And, maybe now you've started delivering some tuition through iPads, maybe students have got a permanent record of their work and, those sorts of things. Is there any aspect of it now that you go, do you know what, even though we can do tuition one-to-one, we're going to keep some of these technological aspects?
Absolutely. I think we're in, and I think a hybrid model definitely needs to be considered. And I think for some students, this works really well. But I think what we do need to be mindful of is, are we looking at a student with quite acute learning needs? Can every child access education for a device? We've got children that have got severe anxiety. Is that child comfortable turning the camera on, for example? And if not, how does that lack of eye contact affect their learning? So I think there needs to be a hybrid approach by all means, but I think it is very much based on that individual learner's needs.
Thanks. And just last question maybe on the pandemic, although it's related to a lot of things. I think sometimes outside of education settings, the world is acting as if, okay, that's all finished now, the whole COVID thing, and we've all just sort of moved on. I mean, what's your experience seeing that? Do you still see many children are missing large periods of school because they're worried about going in, or they have family members who have COVID, and then that means they've got additional tuition needs?
Sadly, that is the case. And children that are so anxious to go back into school, they may have had a parent who's been affected by COVID quite severely, and as a result, just that anxiety that's manifesting. And then sometimes it's a lack of access for them to be seen, perhaps by the CAM service, just sheerly because of waiting time, because of the sheer number of students, young people and children that are waiting to be seen. So we certainly are, and actually then it's really back to the first point that I made, that actually how do we then build that resilience in them to say, okay, how can we work with you before you even start to access that education piece? So it's a huge concern, and a lot of children are missing education as a result, and I guess that's where we step in to become the alternative education provider.
Thank you. Next question. I mean, I assume you're not working entirely alone. You've already mentioned how important the partnership is with the school. Can you tell us a little bit about the role partnerships play?
I'm a really strong advocate in partnerships. I just feel that education cannot be done in a silo. And I think this ranges from our partnerships with schools and local authorities. And on a bigger scale, the Fair Education Alliance, which is an alliance of like-minded charity and social enterprise leaders. And I think one, it's that knowledge sharing that best practice and what's working, and that effective multi-agency working. And I think this really ties in quite closely to safeguarding as well. You know, we hear time and time again, we need to look at some serious case reviews to see actually why did this particular team speak to this team to further safeguard that child. So I guess for us, it really is working with others in this space to really want to increase the impact. But I think there's such a shared mission and values that actually people are doing something really great in that space. And how do we bring this together? So we're so passionate about partnerships, and I guess we want to really engage with the care leaver community more. So we're not saying we have all the answers, but that lived experience can really impact on what we're doing. And how do we do it better?
Thanks. What kind of alumni? I mean, how long have you been going? Actually, one thing maybe you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, so in September we'll be in our 10th year.
Wow. Okay. And do you have like alumni that you keep in touch with, care leavers or others, where you're keeping in touch with how they're doing?
Yeah. So this is something that we absolutely record and see actually how our children and young people doing. I think what I would like to highlight, and I will definitely share this as an interview with Stephen, a care leaver, who actually contacted us on Twitter about his experience and why he believes every young person in care should have access to tutors and the importance of education. I guess really, Raj, the place that we'd really love to be in would be to have a board, actually, to have an alumni board, because it's these young people that can really share their experiences. They tell us what works, what didn't work. And I feel that that's absolutely crucial to how we kind of shape the service going forward.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that's true. In a dream world, some of them come back and do some tutoring for you as well.
That would be amazing. That would be absolutely amazing.
I'm sure there's a lot of people here listening going, all right, this is great. I mean, like, they're probably interested in education interventions generally, but they're probably thinking, okay, this also sounds something I might want to get involved in personally. I mean, what can we do on an individual level and society as a whole?
Yeah, I think for us, first and foremost, join us as a tutor. If you are a qualified teacher, we'd love to hear from you. And even if you're not a qualified teacher, as I said, that we strongly believe in partnerships, and there are some other fantastic charities and social enterprises in the space that also provide tuition, but also just really raising the awareness about the education attainment gap, the education inequality. I think for us is crucial. I think there's so much funding in this space, you know, and I think we really should be providing this high quality support. But also, you know, if you are, I guess, in innovation, there's innovation that needs to be had in this space. So really challenging conventional norms that we have around education. I mean, we have the best education in some ways here in the world, but yet we're failing a third of its children. And it really perplexes me even now. And I think for me, it's about raising the awareness and needs of our children and young people, and wanting to ensure that we're really inclusive. So really kind of using positive behaviour support strategies. But I guess on a bigger scale, really early intervention, and to ensure there is a safety net for vulnerable children. And I think from a wider perspective, actually, how does that then prevent homelessness, substance misuse, county lines, etc. You know, no one wakes up thinking, yes, I want to be homeless today. It's a set of experiences that have possibly led them to that.
Thanks. Started getting a couple of questions in. We had one question in advance from Jennifer Johnston. Thanks for your question. Jennifer asked, what are your thoughts about the use of film to provide a way into reading and writing for pupils who may not have had access to books or written materials inside the home?
Gosh, I think that's a wonderfully creative way for children to access materials, and I guess this really comes into, I mean, are we then perhaps saying, Jennifer, we need to have some technology here? This goes back into my other point that actually, yes, and it sounds very innovative. I think that would be wonderful. I also do feel we don't want to perhaps lose some of that, the access to books and written material, and also this kind of, as we know, research saying that actually that children should be read to and how that increases their confidence. But I'm fully in support of something such as using film, because I think it's quite very creative and innovative.
Thanks. I mean, we did some work a little while ago, actually, before I arrived, so I'm not sure if it's all the light of day, but one thing we were interested in is the use of subtitles to improve literacy. Have you ever tried using those strategies as well, just to sort of help children read more often if they're going to be watching some programs, switch on some subtitles?
So actually, now that I'm hearing you say that, Raj, it's probably something that I wonder our tutors probably have used, particularly when they probably have been teaching online, and how actually that supports students. And I particularly think about my students with English as an additional language, and actually how that would further support, perhaps actually just seeing it written there, how much that would support their learning and picking up the additional language.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I grew up with Bollywood films on in the background and subtitles up there as a standard, so I can imagine that does help.
I do it now. I personally find it quite useful.
All right, okay. A couple more questions coming in on the chat. Thanks, everybody. Keep them coming in. One from John Collar. What do you think is the role of education businesses in levelling the playing field?
I think that's a fantastic question. They have a huge role to play, really. I think we personally ourselves have been really advocating that sometimes students won't always be able to achieve the high standards that are required for apprenticeships, for example, having the 5 A to C's, and actually what do we do? We're missing out on so much talent here, in a generation lost of kind of the next leaders, or whoever they may go on to be. So I think really it's focusing on how they can further come into schools, support schools, and have conversations, and just make sure that they're doing their part in kind of saying, actually, this is available and accessible for all. So I think they've got a huge role to play, and that can run from kind of educational pieces to whether that's funding pieces, or whether that's just kind of it's something around innovation and getting them more involved in what they're doing. So because there's learning it to be had in that alone.
I'm interested in something you mentioned earlier, just talking about inclusivity, and especially when you're talking about children in care, children with special educational needs, that isn't always at the level it could be. What's the sense of, there's so many technological products being used in schools, businesses providing various platforms for teachers to help them. Do you think they're always doing what they could do to address everybody's needs?
Yeah, I think this is quite a challenge, to be honest with you. When I talk about the individual needs, particularly for this cohort, whether that ranges from dyslexia, does that range from ADHD? It's really difficult as to what these digital apps are kind of measuring, what's their baseline, and what they're kind of measuring this against. So I think there is a lot more to be done in that space in terms of what is available, but I think it provides quite a challenge for teachers, actually, because you cannot just use one blanket one that you think may be suitable for the whole class, just because there's a varying level of needs, and we've seen that from the students that we get, and hence taking the preferred model of that one-to-one tuition. Right.
Okay. Thanks. If anybody's got any follow-up questions on that, please just add them to the chat, especially if you've got more direct experience of working with children with special educational needs. I'm just going to move on to the next question from Astrid. Thanks for the great presentation, Kim. Astrid works with an organisation, Learning with Parents, who run the Parental Engagement Forum and use a tech platform to promote parental engagement in children's learning to close the attainment gap. And they'd love to hear more about how your programme is working with parents to support children's learning. We haven't heard so much about their role so far with your work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Astrid. As I mentioned, that education cannot be done in a silo. And so really what this is really strong conversations with parents, carers, whoever that primary caregiver is, to actually really help them understand that tuition isn't just a tutor coming in and sitting down with that child, but actually what can you do once that tutor has gone? What is the learning? What is that student doing thereafter? And how is this being embedded and impacting on their work, whether they're in mainstream education or whether it's just a tutor that they see. So and I think this goes back to my earlier point about this effective strategic partnerships, you know, whether that is with kind of schools, but and families too. So I think there definitely needs to be much more in this space, and I think there's a lot of pressure put on schools and teachers to involve parents more. But I think there probably is a huge piece there, and we do that with our teacher community actually, in terms of kind of training them and various training courses, which are then conversations that are obviously then being had with those parents and carers.
Thanks. It's a really good question. I mean, I've got a follow-up question on this. I mean, what do you think would be the most helpful thing the parents of the children that you work with, the parents or carers of the children that you work with, what's the most helpful thing they might do before, during and after a session with one of your tutors? Just like in concrete terms, can you make it come alive for us? You know, do you want them to help the child, like make sure they're all prepared, and then during, do you want them checking in or giving a bit of space? And
Absolutely.
after, you want them to discuss it? What does that look like before, during, and after?
Absolutely. I think one thing not to kind of take away from that is sometimes there might be a level of anxiety that actually, gosh, I probably won't be able to teach what that tutor is teaching my child, or, you know, my foster child, for example. But actually we're not saying here to replicate what it is that they're doing, but it's just that interest. You know, is it that care? What are you learning? What's going on? And that interest alone really will spark, we've certainly seen spark that conversation in that student and in that child, that, gosh, okay, let me tell you about this. Again, building their confidence. And really then, I guess, just checking in after the session with the tutor. How is it going? You know, is there anything that I can further do, or anything I should be aware of? And I think it's these continuous conversations that really aid that learning.
And I think you just mentioned it, that there might occasionally be some, you know, anxiety amongst the parents or carers, you know, especially if you're looking at GCSE level maths, or like some circle theorem or whatever, they might puff their cheeks out. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about, like, how do you think it's useful for them to take an interest, even if they don't necessarily know? What kinds of questions might be helpful for them to ask? I'm sure there'll be some parents watching here which is generally useful advice for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just so important to know what it is that they're doing. You know, and I guess key dates. Are there any key dates? Are there any kind of examinations coming up? And you know, and where do they feel that there are some gaps? You know, and actually then looking and exploring further resources. We list a whole list of resources on our website to aid both tutors but also parents and carers too. The internet is awash with so many resources, and sometimes it's a bit of a minefield trying to navigate, you know, what's relevant. But I think just having those conversations, and those conversations will then lead you to think, actually, perhaps I should be in contact with the school. You know, is there something further here that we can do, which may then lead that parent or carer to then think, perhaps my child could do with a bit more intervention. Perhaps I go back to the school and raise this. So as we can see, we've got this kind of continuum of conversation.
Interesting. It's going to move on to some of the other questions. Thanks everybody for adding them. Please keep them coming in. And thanks for that question, Astrid. Question here from Tam. Just asking, Kim, what's your perspective on the successes and challenges of the national tutoring programme so far? Some people may have been aware in the news, there's been occasional coverage that the recent delivery hasn't got the numbers in that they wanted. And yet you've also mentioned evidence beforehand saying this is one of the best evidence approaches we've got. What's your overall take on how it's going?
I think first and foremost, it's really important to really celebrate the fact that here we have a government that recognised that there needs to be a catch-up programme. And I think that was absolutely fantastic that has been put in place. To do anything on this scale is going to be a challenge, and therefore perhaps not reaching as many students as it should have. And I think that's been perhaps one of the biggest challenges. But to even embark on something so big, it's inevitable that there would be such challenges. Where children have been able to access this, it's been absolutely fantastic, and we've certainly seen the impact that that's been having, and the confidence and the learning, and even reintegrating some students back into school, as I mentioned, around the anxiety. But there are further challenges. We perhaps are not reaching all the children that we should be, and that for us is a concern.
Do you have any thoughts about? I appreciate you've got enough on your plate. It's not your problem to solve technically, but what kinds of things do you think might help the NTP reach more children?
There needs to be something about further communication and really marketing, speaking to schools and having these conversations, and just to generally get more uptake. I think we need to be mindful that schools are so under pressure with everything else that they're doing and educating children, that how do we also then not add more administrative burden on them? What can we do to take that away? We wouldn't want that to be a barrier. So I think those are the things that would probably be a concern for us on our side, and something that we've certainly seen.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting to see how that unfolds. I mean, there's a related question here from Alistair. Thanks very much for your question. And you talked about it's difficult to run this sort of thing at scale. I guess two questions here from Alistair. One is, what are the challenges of scaling? Like, what's the main thing that you start to? It sounds like your tutors really well, and maybe each child that they're working with as well. What are the challenges of taking that to scale? And what kind of context do you think the approach might be less suited for?
Thank you. It's a great question. For me, it's about actually the community of tutors, and how do we not then lose that culture? I think that's really imperative as we begin to scale and start to look at our cohorts of children, and just we need to stay personal. I bring this back down to culture, which I think is so important, and the fact that we kind of know our students, we know those names, and I think those will probably be some of the challenges. But how do we then still keep a very strong community, which I think is important, and it goes back into those strategic partnerships that I mentioned, really, and how those tie in together. I hope that's a question you're asking around scaling the actual social enterprise as opposed to the national tutoring program, Raj. I hope I've answered that.
I think there's a theme that addresses both, and I think this is part of it. A lot of initiatives can start with a certain zeal, and I'm sure you will have worked with schools where you'll see even an individual teacher runs, a rock climbing club or something, and they manage to create an immense sense of community, and their passion and everything comes across. And every time you add a layer to it, take it one step further, you lose a little bit of that person's passion for it, don't you? And to everyone's best intentions, it just becomes a little bit less personal. So I think your answer addresses both quite neatly. We might come back to some of the NTP later, but I just want to we've got another question coming from Sally. Thanks for your question. And it is interesting here. We had a very specific response to the pandemic, which was DFE, putting money behind something very specific that's evidence-based. And whilst that was appreciated, many schools might have said, actually, we've really got needs elsewhere that we could have used that budget for. What are your thoughts about schools using the budget for NTP and so on more pastorally focused intervention rather than academics?
I'm fully in support of that, absolutely, because whatever that intervention may be, pastorally will definitely impact on the students' learning, and I absolutely think that would be a fantastic thing to do. If it benefits that student, it's going to benefit them holistically, which will thus have impact on their education. So I absolutely think that would be a very good move, quite frankly.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that question, Sally. Next question from Javier Sanz Coro. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Javier. Apologies if I got that slightly wrong. But Javier says, more attention to the power of play is needed, and highlights some research showing it can take many more repetitions to practice up to a new to build a new synapse using practice than it would be with play. When you talk to your tutors who are qualified teachers, do you talk to them about maybe broadening their practice from maybe not being so specifically pedagogical to broadening into other approaches? How do you do that with them, and especially taking advantage of the one-to-one or one-to-small group situation they're working in?
You're absolutely right, and play is very powerful, and actually there's a lot of learning that happens through play. I just want to mention that we've had some reservations from some local authority leaders about actually rolling out iPads, for example, because there is this philosophy that, oh gosh, children are just going to play games. Well, actually that's fantastic, and children should be playing games because actually that's how learning happens. So the beauty of the one-to-one is that level of creativity that can take place, all the way through from early years, even through to secondary, and our tutors are able to do that. So I'm a big advocate of the play, but also tailoring it, and also helping that child be confident enough, not having to sit with direct eye contact, perhaps sometimes with the tutor, but actually learning through play. Then comes that organic conversation.
Don't want to put too much on the spot. Have you got any examples of how those approaches have been used, perhaps in a one-to-one tuition example, which is, you can imagine being trickier in the classroom? I can certainly imagine if you've got one child you're working with, you can take a couple more risks with the style of learning than you could with 30, where if that goes wrong, you've got a problem on your hands, probably.
Right, actually, what comes to mind is one of our tutors using maths, teaching maths with robots, through kind of resilience through maths, and in really engaging that learner. So as you can imagine, really increasing confidence and boost attainment as well. But such a fantastic way to learn.
Yeah, you've got me at robots for sure. I'd love to know what they're asking. Just those of you watching, if you've got any other questions or anything else that hasn't been addressed, please just drop it in the chat. I've got a couple of questions for you, Kim, actually, whilst we're talking here. In a perfect world, I guess, what do you think, what kind of policy support would be in place for what you're doing? The NTP is very much a response to the pandemic. Who knows what the long-term plans are? Do you think this is part of the long-term solution or long-term response to addressing the attainment gap? Would you like to see it stay in place? And as well as that, what other kinds of policy solutions would you think would be necessary to make the kind of progress we all want to see?
Right, I think the NTP will need to run in parallel, just because of the learning loss that has occurred. So I think that definitely still needs to continue in terms of that intervention and that one-to-one, or as some other models are 1-3. But I think there does need to be quite a reform, actually, and looking at some of this education and how this is being delivered, and are we really taking into account some of the needs? And I obviously speak about the children that we serve, and thinking about their challenges, and just the pressures in terms of these specialist school places that are needed, and obviously sometimes the very long wait times and all the learning that's lost aside that. So there really needs to be quite a reform in terms of the schools that are available, how we're really tailoring it to that child's need and making sure education is accessible. But the one-to-one does need to continue, just because of the learning loss.
Right, okay. Just scanning to see if I have any more coming in. So I think we're sort of winding up now. I think the audience questions have sort of all been answered quite satisfactorily. I was going to ask you, just, Kim, have you got any closing remarks for us? What do you want us to really take away? Maybe there was other little nuggets that you wanted to share with us you haven't. What's the lasting narrative you'd like everybody here who's joined us today to take away with them?
I think really, I think one thing to really consider is around kind of social mobility, and how we really support students and support vulnerable students, and and how actually by lifting everybody in society and how much this benefits society as a whole. And I think this is really important, but obviously these things can't be done in a silo, and I think it's just really important for it to be on the forefront of everyone's mind.
Yeah, here to that. Just one more that's come in from George. Thanks for your question, George. It says during the pandemic, the government referred to a large cohort of children as a lost generation, a negative narrative for both child and parent carer. I mean, what type of strategies and approaches do you think could be used to rise above this perception?
Yeah, and actually it doesn't help to have that kind of negative talk about students by any means. I think what's really important is the fact that these children's needs are being addressed, in not just from an educational perspective, but as I mentioned, around kind of mental health, which would be further exacerbated, but also their kind of access to play. Are they around their peers? Obviously, children learn off their peers, and this is really important. And how are families being supported in order to do that? I know we're talking about education here, but I do really think that there needs to be more done in terms of kind of supporting families in the community as well. So that actually it's important for parents and carers to have that sense of community, because actually you're not alone, and I think that makes a huge difference. But again, yeah, George, I agree with you that actually it's definitely not a lost generation by any means, and actually I would argue perhaps a more resilient one, and one to look at in future years and think, my goodness, in kind of to get through these adversities is quite remarkable.
Yeah, 100%. I was really going to add that last point, that some of the children I was teaching had months of not knowing if their GCSEs or their A levels were going to happen, how their university was going to work. And you think how stressful a time that is anyway. And you add this additional layer on top. I think in a few years' time, one would hope many are actually boasting about it, that they were part of that cohort rather than necessarily.
Yeah.
Another quick question from Grace. Yeah, we definitely got time. Thanks for the question. How important do you think social and emotional learning is to help reduce the attainment gap? And this relates to the last question, really. We were talking about resilience, which I think we can fold into social and emotional learning. What's the role there, and how do your tutors address that?
I think it's absolutely crucial, and that's a wonderful question. Thank you. Actually, just how much it links into. We're just measuring. We don't just want to look at kind of attainment. It's more than that. Do you have social skills? And are you able to, converse with people? And do you feel confident enough? So I think it plays a huge factor. A lot of our tutors are there building that self-esteem with students, and thus developing their resilience as well. So I think it plays a huge part in it. And actually, therefore, once that's really developing with students, I feel actually then they're really able to access education, and I think that's really important. But it's got to work together. It can't just be actually let's just merely focus on the educational outcomes for the children and not take this into account.
Do you think that sometimes, this relates to actually a question we had earlier about particularly the NCP being too addressed at academic needs? Do you think there's some element of that about the pandemic response generally in schools, that actually it's targeted almost exclusively academics and perhaps not enough on the other side of things?
Yeah, I think, and Raj, what we see both ends of the spectrum. So, children that are, yes, they might be in care, they're really thriving, doing really well in terms of their educational outcomes. We're working at level 7s to the kind of other end of that spectrum for students that have been so crippled socially, emotionally, that are just not able to access the learning. That's not to say they couldn't go on to achieve these level 7s. And actually that it would be wise, and I think it's something that our tutors really do, is actually look at that pastoral care. For example, we work with children in care. I don't know if that child sometimes has so disrupted in their learning on a Monday because they had contact with a biological parent on the weekend. You know, it was probably in the court order, it's what's been advised, and how much that emotionally impacts their learning. So I think it's really important to be having those conversations, and I know our tutors certainly do check in. Again, this comes back to how are we speaking to parents and carers and involving them. You know, are we speaking to the school? How the school's not being kept in the dark? Are they aware of what's happened?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think some of those situations are extraordinarily powerful, and you never quite know what's going on in a child's background if you're working in a school sometimes, and when you hear, it can really take the wind out of you. Really good question here from George, actually, which I think is a nice one to conclude if nothing else comes in. George has asked, you know, does your organisation offer volunteering, particularly for parents wanting to offer their skills and experience? I guess, if you don't mind, George, I'll just broaden that question a little bit. You mentioned that normally tutors have qualified teacher status, but I'm sure lots of people here want to get involved. What are the general volunteering opportunities for parents and for other people to help in organisations such as yourselves?
We would be absolutely open to having conversations by all means, and this really feeds into kind of the whole society piece and you know, what can society do as a whole, as well as the community piece and strategic alliances. And actually, George, at the moment we don't offer that, but I'd be more than welcome to open to having conversations. As I say, that there are other leaders and charities that are in this space, and perhaps those introductions could be made and those conversations could be had. Obviously, we use qualified teachers just because of the nature of the children that we serve, but that's not to say that there aren't ways that other people could get involved, by all means.
Thanks very much, Kim. Right, I just want to close things up here. Kim, I want to really thank you for spending your time with us today. It's been fantastic hearing about the work Equal Education does and actually talking about some of the bigger issues that are behind it. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. Okay, so everybody else who's still on the stream, we would love you, please, just to fill in a short survey just to give us some feedback about these events. The link's going to be shared in the chat, and it's also going to be available in the event's description. And as a thank you for filling out the survey, you can enter a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop voucher, which I'm sure would be more than welcome by everybody. Just before I sign off, the next Nesta Talks To event, not easy to say, is with Professor Graham Donaldson, who's going to be in conversation with A Fairer Start's Helen Wales, who runs our work, funny enough, in Wales, on Thursday, 19th of May at 12 p.m. Details can be found on Nesta's website. Thanks very much for joining us, everybody, today, and look forward to seeing you next time.